She entered the cave because there was no place left for her in the world. And inside that darkness that smelled of wet mineral and years without light, Sarah Colton found what no man of power had been able to bury completely: the truth. But that came later, 4 months later to be exact. The story begins in March in the year 1887 with the sound of knocking before dawn. Deputy Wade Sutter stood on the porch of the Adobe house on the outskirts of Hardrock Gulch, with his hat in both hands and his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere below Sarah Colton's chin. He was 28 years old and had not yet learned how to deliver death without flinching. He told her that the Providence mine had collapsed during the night shift. 22 men trapped. A terrible accident. An act of God. A tragedy without blame. Those were the words the company had given him, and he repeated them the way a man repeats a prayer he does not believe in but cannot refuse to say. Sarah stood in the doorway in her nightgown with one hand on the doorframe and the other pressed flat against her stomach, as though holding something inside herself from falling. She asked the only question that mattered. Is James alive? Sutter's jaw tightened. He told her that 19 of the 22 men had been pulled out after 2 days. Their lungs full of calcium dust, their eyes the color of limestone but alive. James Colton was one of 3 who were never found. His fellow miners said they had seen him on the lowest level just before the collapse, that he had been running upward, that someone had shouted to close the blast doors before he finished climbing. Sarah asked the question again, though she already knew the answer. Not the question about James, a different one. Who gave the order to close the doors? Sutter didn't answer. He placed his hat against his chest and took one step backward, then another. Then he turned and walked to his horse without looking back. Sarah watched him go and felt something shift inside her chest, something structural, like a load-bearing wall giving way in a house that would remain standing for a while longer, but would never again be sound. That night, alone in the house James had bought with 5 years of savings before their wedding, Sarah lay in the dark and remembered the way her husband talked about the mine. James Colton was not a man who wasted words. He spoke about the Providence the way a craftsman speaks about his tools, with precision and without sentiment. He described the timbering, the ventilation shafts, the particular sound that rock makes before it fractures, all with the quiet authority of a man who understood his work and respected it enough to fear it properly. But 3 weeks before he died, he had said something different. They were eating supper beans and cornbread, and James set down his spoon and looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen before. A heaviness behind the eyes that was not fatigue. People don't die because rock falls, Sarah, he said. People die because somebody decides that the timber holding up the ceiling is worth more than the men standing under it. She had not understood. She had asked him what he meant, and he had shaken his head and picked up his spoon and changed the subject to the leak in the roof that needed patching before spring rain. Now, lying in their bed that was no longer their bed, but only hers, she understood. She understood with the particular clarity that arrives too late to save anyone, but just in time to fuel something else entirely. The funeral was held on a Thursday morning, under a sky so blue it seemed cruel. There was no body. There would never be a body. The mine had swallowed James Colton whole and would not give him back, and so the pine coffin that 6 miners carried to the cemetery behind the Methodist church contained nothing but a pair of work boots that Sarah had polished until they shone, and a photograph from their wedding day that she had wrapped in cloth so it would not be damaged by the dark. Reverend Josiah Whitfield presided. He was a man of 55 with a voice made for comfort and hands made for shaking, and he spoke about the will of God and the mystery of suffering and the importance of acceptance with the practiced ease of someone who had delivered these words many times before and had come to believe them through repetition rather than conviction. When he finished, he looked at Sarah with what he clearly intended as compassion. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away," he said. "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Sarah stood at the edge of the empty grave and did not bless anyone. After the other mourners had filed past with their murmured condolences, she approached Whitfield. The cemetery was nearly empty. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the mesquite beyond the fence, indifferent to grief. "Reverend," she said, "if God wanted James dead, then who gave the order to close the blast doors before he got out?" Whitfield's expression shifted. The compassion remained, but something else appeared beneath it, something closer to irritation, the way a man looks when a woman asks a question he considers above her station. "Sarah," he said, lowering his voice, "grief makes us say things we shouldn't. Don't turn yourself into an enemy of the whole town." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked through the cemetery gate and did not look back at the empty coffin or the Reverend or the meadowlark. She walked home with her back straight and her hands at her sides and the first faint stirring of something that was not yet anger, but would become anger soon enough. 2 weeks after the symbolic burial, a document arrived at her door. It bore the stamped seal of the Blackwood and Sons Mining Company and was signed by the attorney Emmett Blackwood, brother of the deceased Cornelius Blackwood, who had died the previous year, leaving the company and all its debts in the hands of his brother-in-law, Randall Marsh. The document stated in the tight, cold language of lawyers that James Colton had signed during his lifetime a salary advance contract totaling $300, and that said debt, according to Clause 7 of the attached employment agreement, fell upon the conjugal property in the event of the debtor's death. The conjugal property of James Colton consisted, according to the same document, of the Adobe house with its corral on the outskirts of Hardrock Gulch and the work implements contained within. Sarah read the document 3 times. The 3rd time she read it aloud slowly, as though hearing the words spoken might reveal something the printed text concealed. It did not. The words meant exactly what they appeared to mean. She was being told that her dead husband owed money he had never mentioned on a contract he had signed in a language he could barely read, and that the debt would be paid with the only thing she had left in the world. She took the document to Sheriff Graydon and the next morning. Graydon was a man of 53 with a walrus mustache and the habit of listening to women with the same attention he gave to the wind, acknowledging its existence without granting it importance. He received her standing with his hat on, which in Hardrock Gulch was equivalent to telling someone you did not intend to stay long in your own conversation. "The contract is legal, Mrs. Colton," he said without having read the paper. "If your husband signed it, it's valid." "My husband couldn't read English," Sarah answered. "Nobody explained to him what he was signing. That's between you and the company. The collapse wasn't an accident." The sheriff looked at her then, but it was a look that did not see a person. It saw a problem. He adjusted his gun belt and pointed toward the door with his chin. "Mrs. Colton, I'm sorry about your husband, but I don't have jurisdiction over civil contracts, and even less over accidents in private mines. That's the county's business." The county's business was handled by Judge Abner Fitch, who had also been a silent partner in Blackwood and Sons for 11 years, though Sarah would not discover that particular detail until later. She was walking across the dusty street toward her wagon when she heard footsteps behind her. Quick, deliberate. She turned and found Sutter, the young deputy, standing 3 paces away. He glanced over his shoulder at the sheriff's office, then back at her. "Mrs. Colton," he said, speaking low and fast, "I can't say anything in there, but you should ask who gave the order to pull the support timbers from the lowest level before the collapse." Before she could respond, he turned and walked back inside. The door closed. Sarah stood in the street with the dust settling around her boots and the sun pressing down on her shoulders, and a new piece of information lodged in her mind like a splinter that could not be removed without tearing something open. The support timbers had been pulled. The collapse was not an accident. She knew this now. But knowing and proving were separated by a distance she could not yet measure. The lawyer Hector Vine had his office above the hardware store. He charged by the consultation and offered genuine kindness along with total uselessness. He examined the contract and told Sarah with the delicacy of a man who knows he is saying what no one wants to hear, that the agreement appeared irregular, but that challenging it would require documentary evidence that James had been deceived, that this would cost more money than she had, and that even if she won, the local judges tended to rule in favor of companies with roots in the county. Sarah sat in the wooden chair across from his desk and absorbed this information with the stillness of someone who has already begun to understand that the system is not broken. It is working exactly as designed, just not for people like her. Then Vine did something she did not expect. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a stack of folders, 6 of them, each one containing a case nearly identical to hers. Miners who had died or been injured, families stripped of property through contracts the workers had not understood, debts manufactured from advances that may or may not have been given. 6 families in 10 years, all processed through the same machinery of legal predation. "I've kept these files," Vine said, "because I believe that someday someone will be able to use them. But that person needs money and power that you don't have, Mrs. Colton." He paused. "I'm sorry." He handed her a piece of paper with the names of the 6 families. She folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket next to the contract she could not fight and the knowledge she could not prove. She thanked Vine and walked downstairs through the hardware store and out into the afternoon heat, carrying information that made her situation simultaneously clearer and more impossible. The women of Hardrock Gulch, the ones who sat together in church and borrowed flour from each other on Sundays, took less than a week to pull away. They did not do it out of malice, most of them. They did it out of fear. Blackwood and Sons employed the father or brother or husband of nearly every woman in town. Associating with the troublesome widow was a luxury no one could afford. The Sunday after the contract arrived, Sarah went to church. She walked to her usual pew and sat down. Helen Briggs, who had been her closest friend since the day Sarah arrived in Hardrock Gulch, as a new bride, stood up without a word and moved to a different row. She did not look at Sarah. She did not apologize. She simply relocated herself as though the seat next to Sarah had become contaminated. After the service, Whitfield approached her in the aisle. His voice was gentle, which made what he said worse. "Sarah, your presence here is making things difficult for people. Perhaps you should pray at home for a while." Sarah looked at him. "God is everywhere," she said, "but I'm not allowed in his house." Whitfield did not answer. Sarah walked out of the church and down the steps and into the noon sun, and that was the last time she set foot inside the Methodist Church of Hardrock Gulch. On the walk home, she remembered something James had told her one evening in that way of his, where he mentioned important things as if they weren't important at all. He'd talked about a new miner named Kowalski, a Pole who spoke no English, who had been made to sign a 3-page contract without understanding a single word. James had translated it for him, reading each clause aloud in the simple English Kowalski could follow. The foreman found out and warned James to mind his own business. James told Sarah about it in his even tone, but that night he spent longer than usual sharpening his axe on the whetstone behind the house, the way he always did when something was working through him that he wasn't ready to say aloud. She understood now that James had not simply been a victim. He had begun to resist before they killed him. The eviction order came in May. Sarah endured 2 months in the Adobe house After the first notice, surviving on the dwindling stores in the pantry and the charity of Nell Hutchins, a 68-year-old washerwoman who had nothing left to lose because she had already lost everything worth having. Nell gave Sarah broth in silence in equal measure without asking questions because she understood that some griefs do not improve with discussion. In the last week of May, with the eviction date approaching like weather, Nell told Sarah something while sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with a blanket across her knees and her breathing shallow with the pneumonia that would kill her within days. "There was a woman," Nell said, "years back, German woman, red hair. Her husband worked the salt caves up in the hills before Blackwood bought everything. He died too, same as yours. Same story, same papers, same men taking everything." She coughed a wet sound that rattled in her thin chest. "Her name was Martha Weaver. She lived in those caves for a while after they took her house, and she hid something up there before she left. I never knew what." Sarah leaned forward. "Where did she go?" "Nobody knows. She just vanished one day. But whatever she hid in those caves, she meant for someone to find it." Nell closed her eyes. Someone with a reason to look. Nell Hutchins died on a Wednesday afternoon in late May, peacefully and without ceremony, and Sarah Colton lost her last shelter. But she carried with her now two threads pointing to the same destination. James had once mentioned the old salt caves northeast of the excavated hills, past the second dry creek bed, up the schist slope. And now Nell had confirmed that someone named Martha Weaver had hidden something there, something connected to the same pattern of death and theft that had consumed Sarah's own life. She packed what little remained: a blanket, her mother's kitchen knife, a canteen, the black morning dress she still had not been able to fully shed, as though removing it would be an admission that the morning was complete when it was not. She sold the last piece of furniture, a rocking chair James had built from pine, and used the money to buy a mole from a rancher on the South Road who looked at her with the particular expression of a man who knows he is selling a dying animal to someone who cannot afford a living one. Before dawn on the second Monday of July, Sarah Colton left Hardrock Gulch. She stopped once at the edge of town in front of the Adobe house. Someone had already changed the lock. A new padlock hung on the gate stamped with the Blackwood and Sons mark. She looked at the wooden corral James had built with his own hands at the apple tree he had planted the spring after their wedding that was just beginning to bear fruit. She placed her hand on the fence rail and held it there for 3 seconds. Then she removed it and walked away without entering, without looking back. The mule died 2 miles outside of town. It was July, and the sun came down without asking permission to kill. Sarah watched the animal drop to its knees first, then onto its side with a low, resigned groan that struck her as too similar to the sound she herself had made the night they told her James would not be coming out of the mine. She stood over the dead mule and did not cry. She had spent every tear she owned. What remained was something harder, quieter, more like a decision than an emotion. She loaded the bundle onto her shoulder and kept walking. The excavated hills of the Hardrock Gulch mining district were the closest thing to the end of the world Sarah had ever seen. Mounds of displaced red earth, skeletons of wooden scaffolding, rusted windlass wheels that no longer turned mine, mouths sealed with planks, or simply left open and dark like wounds that no one had bothered to close. The smell was mineral and ancient, a mixture of old sulfur and calcium dust that lodged in the throat. The July sun fell straight down on her shoulders. There was no shade. It took her 2 hours longer than expected to find the second dry creek bed because the first one was wider than anticipated and she had to circle around. The schist slope presented itself exactly as James had described it: blue-gray, brittle underfoot, with sagebrush clinging to the cracks, with the stubbornness of things that survive where they should not. She climbed using her free hands, scraping her palms raw, sweating through the black dress that absorbed the heat like punishment. Near the third escarpment, she stumbled on a mesquite root protruding from the rock and fell to her knees. When she raised her eyes to curse the root, she saw the entrance. It was not imposing. An opening in the rock, perhaps 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide, framed by the remains of a timber arch that someone had built years ago and that time had left leaning but not entirely defeated. Above the lintel, carved into the rock with a clumsy chisel, 3 letters, S-A-L. Sarah stood. She wiped her bleeding palms on the black dress and looked into the darkness inside the cave. The rage she had been carrying since March, the rage at the contract James never understood, at the sheriff who did not listen, at the neighbors who pulled away at the reverend, who told her to pray at home, at the mule dead in the red dirt, at everything found in that moment at a place to settle that was not her chest. It transformed into something else. It became a step forward. She entered. The darkness inside the salt cave was not complete. About 20 paces from the entrance, where the tunnel curved gently to the left, a vertical fissure in the ceiling rock allowed a thread of midday light to fall onto the stone floor with almost surgical precision. Beneath that thread of light, as though placed there by someone who believed in providence or geometry, sat a miner's lamp. It was blackened tin oil type with the reservoir still partially full, judging by the weight when she picked it up. Beyond the lamp, the tunnel widened into a chamber with a low ceiling, but generous dimensions, roughly 30 feet long by 15 wide. The walls were veined with white, which was indeed salt. She could see it glinting in the faint light, could taste it in the air, dry and clean, in a way that felt alien after the dusty heat outside. What she found in that chamber took her a moment to catalog, because the desperation of recent months had taught her not to trust what she saw before she verified it. Against the far wall, partially covered by a canvas tarp that someone had laid with the care of a person protecting something valuable, were 2 objects. The first was what mattered immediately, a long wooden box of the type used for rifles. When she lifted the tarp with careful hands, she found not 1 but 2 Winchester carbines caliber .44-40 wrapped in wax cloth with their actions clean. Beside them, a leather pouch that contained 42 cartridges in good condition. Sarah Colton had fired a rifle exactly twice in her life, both times on her father's ranch when she was 12, and she had not hit the target at either time. But she held the carbine with steady hands and thought about James, about Sheriff Graydon, about the attorney Emmett Blackwood and his stamped document, and she decided she would learn. The second object under the tarp was a wooden trunk with iron fittings locked with a padlock that gave way on the first sharp blow from the rifle butt. Inside, 3 wool blankets folded with care, a set of men's clothing, shirt, trousers, work boots nearly new, that were, she discovered with astonishment, only 1 size larger than her own. And at the bottom, a tin box sealed with wax that she did not open yet. She spent the next hour inspecting the rest of the chamber, found a shallow well barely 4 feet deep dug into the back floor with a rope and a rusted but functional bucket. She lowered the bucket, heard it strike water, pulled it up. The water smelled of clean mineral and tasted barely brackish, drinkable. Enough. At the far end of the chamber, nearly invisible in the darkness, a low opening. You would have to duck to pass through. It indicated that the cave system continued deeper. Sarah peered in, saw the darkness extend, and decided that could wait. She had water shelter and weapons. The cave was not abandoned. The clean rifles, the good ammunition, the boots that nearly fit the oil still in the lamp. Martha Weaver had not simply hidden something and fled. She had prepared this place for whoever came next. She had provisioned a refuge for a woman she would never meet against a day she could only imagine, with the faith of someone who plants a tree knowing she will never sit in its shade. Sarah lit the lamp with the flint striker she found in the trunk and began to clean. She swept the dust from the floor with a branch of dry sage brought from outside. She arranged the blankets in the driest corner. She studied the entrance with new eyes. The timber arch could be reinforced. The entrance could be defended. The angle of the tunnel curve meant that no one outside could see directly into the interior. She ate the last of her provisions, half a dry corn tortilla and 2 withered figs, and lay down on the blankets with the carbine beside her. That was when she heard them. First, the hooves, 3 horses she calculated, or 4 moving slowly down the slope, with the caution of men who do not wish to announce their arrival. Then voices muffled by the rock but audible. Trail ends up here by the caves. She went in for sure. A pause. Footsteps on the schist approaching the entrance. Sarah extinguished the lamp. She pressed herself against the wall beside the tunnel curve, outside the line of sight from the entrance, with the carbine cocked and her lungs operating in silence. Because she had learned in 4 months that fear does not disappear. It only becomes usable if you allow it. "Hey, anybody in there?" The voice belonged to a young man with the tone of someone who asks a question, hoping not to receive an answer. Sarah did not respond. "Randall says the miner's wife is out here somewhere. If she's in the caves, Randall wants to know." Randall Marsh. The name dropped into her stomach like a stone into a well. So they were already looking for her, 4 months after the eviction, and she still mattered to the man who had taken her house, to the man whose name appeared on every document that had dismantled her life, to the man whose employees had sealed the blast doors while James was still climbing. Footsteps in the tunnel entrance. Someone entered 2-3 steps, stopped in the total darkness. "There's nothing. Dark as pitch in here. Look harder. No lamp. Nothing. If she came in here, she's dead, or she went out the other side." A brief argument, inaudible. Then the sound of someone spitting against the rock. "Randall's wasting breath on a widow with nowhere to go. By tomorrow she'll have crossed into the next county. You tell him that." More footsteps on the schist. The sound of horses moving away, slow at first, then at a trot. Sarah waited. She counted to 200. She waited more. When she lit the lamp again, her hands were not trembling as much as she had expected. What was trembling was something more internal, something closer to a comprehension than a fear. Randall Marsh was searching for her, which meant there was something here that he did not want her to find. If she were merely a harmless widow, a woman with nowhere to go, a problem that would solve itself by morning, when she crossed into the next county, then why send men to check? The answer changed everything. It turned her from a woman hiding into a woman searching. She turned toward the low opening at the back of the chamber, the one that led deeper into the cave system, and she looked at it with new eyes. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she would go in. Outside, the July sun was dropping toward the excavated hills, painting them the color of dried blood. Inside the salt cave, Sarah Colton lay on wool blankets that a German woman had folded 14 years ago, holding a rifle she was only beginning to learn how to use, carrying in her pocket a list of 6 families destroyed by the same machine that had destroyed hers, and feeling for the first time since March something that was not hope, because hope implies uncertainty, but something more foundational. The knowledge that she was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning to look for the thing that powerful men had tried to bury. And powerful men do not bury things that cannot hurt them. The first thing Sarah did the next morning was not go deeper into the cave. It was pick up the Winchester and step outside into the gray light before sunrise, and aim at a flat rock 30 paces down the schist slope and pull the trigger. The shot cracked across the excavated hills with a sound that announced itself to every living thing within 2 miles. The bullet struck 6 feet left of the rock and sent a spray of shale into the sagebrush. Sarah worked the lever action, chambered another round, adjusted her stance the way her father had shown her 21 years ago on the ranch in the valley, and fired again. Closer. Still wrong. The third shot chipped the edge of the rock. The fourth, on the morning of the second day, hit a jackrabbit clean from 20 paces while it sat motionless beside the dry creek bed, staring at her with the calm of an animal that had never encountered a human with a reason to shoot. She did not celebrate the kill. She skinned the rabbit with her mother's knife, cooked it over a small fire inside the chamber where the smoke would rise through the ceiling fissure, and ate the first real meat she had tasted in weeks. Then she repaired the timber arch at the entrance using salvaged wood from a collapsed scaffold she found 100 paces up the slope. She sharpened the knife against the salt rock wall. She stitched using thread pulled from the hem of the black morning dress, a hidden pocket inside the man's work shirt from the trunk. The shirt hung loose on her frame, but allowed her to move with a freedom that 4 months of grief and black fabric had not permitted. On the second day, she descended the slope to gather prickly pear fruit from the cactus growing along the dry creek bed. She was cutting the spines from a ripe tuna with her knife when she heard the footsteps. Not hooves this time. Boots on loose rock, moving without hurry, but without stealth, either the gait of someone who wanted to be heard before being seen. She dropped behind a boulder and laid the carbine across the top with the barrel pointed toward the sound. The man who came around the bend in the creek bed was Wade Sutter. He was alone. He wore no badge, no hat, no gun belt, just a cotton shirt, dark with sweat, and trousers tucked into riding boots. He stopped 15 feet from the boulder and raised both hands, palms forward. "Don't shoot, Mrs. Colton. I'm not here on orders." Sarah did not lower the rifle. "Then why are you here?" Sutter let his hands drop slowly. He looked older than he had the morning he delivered the news of James's death, though only 2 months had passed. The skin beneath his eyes was the color of ash. "Because the foreman of the Providence pulled the support timbers from the lowest level 3 weeks before the collapse," he said. "He did it on direct orders from Randall Marsh. Marsh sold the timber to the railroad construction crew working the line through Cedar Pass. Your husband saw it happen. Your husband objected. He told the foreman those men were going to die." Sutter's voice did not waver, but his hands hanging at his sides were not still. 3 weeks later, the mine came down. The words settled into the morning air between them. Sarah felt something rearrange inside her chest, not the grief which had its own permanent architecture by now, but the anger. The anger had been formless for months, a heat without direction. Now it acquired edges. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I haven't slept since March." Sarah lowered the rifle 2 inches. "Not all the way." "Would you say this in front of a judge?" The silence that followed was the longest she had experienced since the night James died. Sutter looked at the ground, then at the hills, then at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "I have a wife and 2 children, Mrs. Colton," he said, and then he turned and walked back the way he had come, and the sound of his boots on the loose rock grew fainter until it merged with the wind moving through the sagebrush. Sarah sat behind the boulder for a long time after he left. She had confirmation now. Not proof that would hold in a courtroom, not a document with a signature, but the word of a man whose conscience was eating him from the inside out. Marsh had ordered the timbers pulled. The collapse was engineered. James had known, had protested, and had died for it. She climbed back to the cave carrying the prickly pear fruit in the fold of her shirt and a weight in her mind that was heavier than anything she carried in her hands. On the 4th day, she opened the sealed tin box from the bottom of the trunk. She had been putting it off. She realized the way a person delays opening a letter that might contain either salvation or ruin. The wax seal was old but unbroken, a dark amber that crumbled when she pried it with the knife tip. Inside, she found $7 in carefully folded bills, and beneath the money a notebook with black cardboard covers of the type used by bookkeepers filled with tight handwriting in blue ink that had run in some passages from moisture, but was for the most part legible. Sarah carried the notebook to the spot beneath the ceiling fissure, where the midday light fell in its narrow beam, and sat down on the stone floor and began to read. It was the diary of Martha Weaver. The first entries were dated 1871, 16 years ago. Martha and her husband, Heinrich, had arrived in the mining district when the salt concessions were still profitable. They had worked for 4 years. They had saved enough to purchase rights to a secondary vein that the company engineers had dismissed as unproductive. The handwriting in the early entries was orderly, almost buoyant. Heinrich found something on level 3 that the engineers missed. He says there's silver beneath the salt in the base rock. He says it's ours. The entries from 1873 changed. The letters grew smaller, pressed together as though the writer were trying to fit more truth into less space. The man from the bank came again. Says the equipment loan is due in 30 days. I told him Heinrich is sick and cannot go up. He looked at me the way people look at a stain on a tablecloth. Then in an entry marked only with a Thursday, Heinrich died. The doctor said it was the lungs. I know it was exhaustion. I know it was what they did to him. Sarah stopped reading. She closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest and breathed. Then she opened it again. The man from the bank is Cornelius Blackwood, the same one who bought the rights to the neighboring concession for half its value when the previous owner had to leave. I know what he wants. He wants this cave. He wants what Heinrich found on level 3. I will not give it to him. The final entries from November 1873 were shorter, the handwriting more erratic. He sent his legal man, someone named Marsh, with papers saying Heinrich signed something I don't remember. They say we owe money. They say the cave is collateral. I don't care what the papers say. Sarah read the name twice. Marsh, the same name, the same man, or the same function wearing a different year. She continued, I hid what we found. I hid the proof. If someone reads this, look beneath the heart of the hearth. And then the last entry undated. I'm leaving. I have no more strength to stay, but I'm not taking what we found. I leave it here for someone to use when I no longer can. Sarah closed the notebook slowly. She sat beneath the thread of light and let the full weight of what she had read settle into her understanding. Randall Marsh, the same surname that appeared in the banker's roll in Martha Weaver's diary. The same man who now ran Blackwood and Sons, who had manufactured the debt against James, who had sent riders to hunt Sarah down in these hills. The pattern was not coincidence. It was method. It was a system refined over 14 years, applied to one immigrant family after another, one widow after another, with the mechanical efficiency of a machine designed to convert human lives into profit. Martha and Sarah had never met. They were separated by 14 years and an ocean of circumstance. But sitting in the same cave, reading by the same light, falling through the same crack in the same rock, Sarah felt something that went beyond sympathy. She thought of James's hands after a shift in the mine, the way he washed them 3 times and still could not get the black grit out of the creases around his fingernails. She used to hold his hand while they slept and feel those traces of the mine against her fingertips. Martha must have done the same with Heinrich, must have known the same texture of labor that no amount of soap could fully wash away. 2 women in the same darkness, 14 years apart, both knowing what it felt like to hold the hand of a man the mine was slowly taking. She tucked the diary into the pocket she had sewn inside the work shirt over her heart and turned toward the low opening at the back of the chamber. Beneath the heart of the hearth, she took the lamp and ducked through. The second tunnel was narrower than the first. The ceiling scraped her back in places, and the smell was different, less salt, more deep mineral, the scent of earth that had never known the sun. Sarah advanced with the lamp held high and her left hand touching the wall for orientation. After about 40 paces, the tunnel opened again into a smaller chamber, no more than 15 feet on each side with an uneven floor. But what stopped Sarah was not the size of the chamber. It was what she saw in the center of the floor. Flat stones arranged in a circle, blackened by the smoke of an old fire forming what had clearly been someone's hearth. Martha Weaver's cooking fire. The heart of the hearth. She knelt. She pushed the stones aside one by one until she reached the central stone, the largest, the flattest, the one a mason would have called the keystone. The earth beneath it yielded differently to the touch, looser, deliberately disturbed. She pulled out her mother's knife and began to dig. She found the tin at 8 inches of depth. It was larger than the first one, sealed with black wax that still held. She lifted it with both hands and held it under the lamplight. It took 10 minutes to force the lid without damaging the contents. Inside first, a small leather pouch. She opened it. 4 nuggets of quartz veined with silver, each the size of her thumb, and a fifth larger that flashed under the lamp with an intensity that stopped her breath. These were not salt. These were not mine waste. They were vein samples, native silver rich of the type that geologists called bonanza grade. Beneath the pouch, folded with the precision of someone who knew she was creating a record that might outlive her 4 documents. The first was the original mining concession title for Level 3, signed by Heinrich Weaver, with the county seals intact. The second was a handwritten letter from a mining engineer named Aldous Fenn, dated 1873, describing the silver vein on Level 3 and estimating its minimum value at $10,000. The third was a copy of a loan contract signed by Heinrich Weaver, with notes in the margins in Martha's handwriting, indicating the clauses that had not been translated for the German immigrant who barely spoke English. The fourth was a copy of an internal letter from Blackwood and Sons, signed by Cornelius Blackwood himself and addressed to his agent Marsh, instructing him specifically to ensure that the Weaver concession was acquired before December of 1873, because the engineer Fenn had confirmed the value of the vein and they could not allow a foreigner to keep that fortune. The letter stated with the coldness of commerce that they need not apologize to anyone, and that if Heinrich Weaver refused to sell voluntarily, there were other methods that had proven effective before. Heinrich Weaver died in November of 1873, 3 weeks after that letter was written. Sarah held the 4 documents in her hands and felt something that was not hope, because she had learned to distrust hope, and not anger, because anger had already found its place. What she felt was closer to gravity, the inescapable pull of evidence toward consequence. These papers were sufficient. They were the distance between a widow no one believed and a woman holding the killer's own handwriting. She placed the documents and the silver samples inside her shirt against her skin and was about to stand when she heard it. From outside, distant but unmistakable, the ring of a horseshoe against rock. Not the careless approach of the men who had come before. This was deliberate. Multiple riders moving in formation up the schist slope. Sarah grabbed the lamp and moved back through the narrow tunnel toward the main chamber with a speed that was not running but was something more purposeful. She emerged into the larger space and extinguished the lamp in the same motion, pressing herself against the blind wall beside the entrance, with the carbine cocked and the documents secure against her chest. The voices arrived before the men. "Sheriff says somebody fired a rifle up here 4 days ago. That's the woman for sure. What do you want to do with her?" The answer came from a different voice than the 2 before. Deeper. carrying the specific cadence of a man who does not need to raise his volume for everyone to know he is the authority in any room he enters. What I want to do with her doesn't matter. What matters is what's in those caves. Old Cornelius told me before he died that the weavers stashed something in here, something that could cause problems if it surfaces. We find it and we destroy it. A pause. And if the woman is here, so much the better. 2 problems solved at once. Sarah recognized the voice. She had heard it only once at the county courthouse, the day she went to protest the eviction. She had been sitting on a wooden bench while a man now speaking discussed a water rights matter with Judge Fitch, with the ease of 2 partners who had long ago stopped pretending their relationship was anything other than what it was. Randall Marsh, the brother-in-law of Cornelius Blackwood, the man whose name appeared in Martha Weaver's diary as the agent who destroyed her life, the man who had ordered the timber pulled from the mine where James Colton was working. He entered the cave followed by 3 men. Sarah heard them stop when the darkness covered them. She heard the scratch of matches. She saw the flare of a lantern that did not reach her corner. Marsh moved toward the back of the chamber, sweeping the lantern while his men spread out. "She's not here," one said. "There's blankets, ash from a recent fire." "She's in the back tunnel," Marsh said. Sarah heard the click of a revolver being cocked. "Go." 2 of the 3 men advanced toward the low opening at the back. The 3rd stayed beside Marsh. Marsh stood in the center of the chamber with the lantern, his back partially turned toward the corner, where Sarah was motionless. She calculated. 2 men entering the back tunnel would reach the smaller chamber within a minute. They would find the disturbed earth around the hearthstones. They would know someone had been digging. She had approximately the time it takes a man to walk 40 paces in a crouch before everything changed. She stepped out of the corner. "Don't move." Her voice came out firmer than she expected. Marsh spun, the lantern swung, and for an instant the light caught her fully. A woman of 33, in a man's work shirt, hair loose and covered in dust, holding a Winchester carbine aimed at the chest of the most powerful man in Hardrock County. The 3rd man raised his revolver. "The one who moves that gun, I shoot Marsh," Sarah said. A pause. The kind measured not in seconds but in the calculations of men assessing whether a woman with a rifle is bluffing. "Put that down," Marsh said. The lantern steadied. His voice carried the practiced calm of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You're a woman alone with a rifle you probably don't know how to use. 4 shots from 20 paces this week," Sarah said. She did not take her eyes from his. "Everyone hit. You want to find out about the 5th? Marsh did not answer immediately. She watched his eyes move not to her face, but to the rifle, calculating the distance, the angle, the steadiness of her hands. She watched him arrive at a conclusion he did not like. Then a sound from the cave entrance, quick footsteps on the schist, and a voice that cut through the tension in the chamber the way a scalpel cuts through infected tissue. A woman's voice, severe and calm, carrying no trace of alarm. "Federal Marshal, District of New Mexico, nobody moves a foot." Sarah did not shift her gaze from Marsh, but she saw at the edge of her vision the figure entering the cave. A woman of about 60 with white hair gathered beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a federal badge pinned to the chest of a dark coat. Behind her, 2 men wearing the stars of United States Marshals. "Drop the weapon, Marsh," the woman said, "and tell your men to put their hands up." Marsh did not whoa for a moment. Sarah did not lower the carbine. The salt chamber smelled of mineral and something new that she identified after a second. The specific scent of power-changing hands. "Who the hell are you?" Marsh said. "My name is Agatha Poole. I'm an investigator with the Federal Department of Justice, and I've spent 8 months tracking the operations of Blackwood and Sons in this county." She paused. The 2 marshals had moved to either side of the chamber entrance, cutting off the exit. The man beside Marsh slowly raised his hands. From the back tunnel came the sound of the other two men returning, emerging from the low opening, to find a situation entirely different from the one they had left. This morning, Agatha continued, I received a letter from a journalist in Santa Fe who informed me that the widow of James Colton was in these caves with evidence I have been searching for since last December. Sarah lowered the carbine slowly, 1 inch at a time. She looked at Agatha Poole at the white hair and the badge and the lines around the eyes that spoke of decades spent navigating a world built to exclude her, and she recognized something. Not a friend, not yet. Something more precise. A woman who had made herself into a weapon the system could not confiscate. A journalist, Sarah said, her name is Clara Penn. She says your husband contacted her 6 weeks before the collapse. She says James Colton was her source on the irregularities at the Providence mine. The words reached Sarah, and for a moment she could not process them. James had spoken to a journalist. James had known, not just about the timbers, not just about the danger, but about the scope of it, the pattern, the system. He had found Clara Penn, or Clara Penn had found him, and he had begun to build a case that would bring the whole structure down. He had done this while still descending into the mine every morning, while still eating supper across the table from Sarah, while still sharpening his axe in the evening, with that particular focus that she now understood was not routine, but preparation. She says he saw the foreman removing support timbers on Marsh's direct orders. Agatha continued. He wrote down the names of the men who gave the order and hid the paper inside his boot. He and Clara agreed she would publish when she had enough evidence to make it stick. Agatha's voice did not soften, but something in her posture shifted a recognition that what she was saying carried weight beyond the informational. The collapse happened before she had enough. James had known he might die. He had known, and he had acted anyway, not with the dramatic gestures of a man seeking glory, but with the quiet, methodical actions of a man who understood that the most important work is the kind that continues after you are gone. He had left a thread, a single thread, running from his boot through a journalist's notebook to a federal investigator to this moment in a salt cave where his wife stood holding the evidence that made the thread complete. Sarah reached inside her shirt and removed the documents. She held them out. I found these buried beneath the hearthstones in the back chamber, she said. The original Weaver mining concession, a letter from the engineer who surveyed the silver vein, a loan contract with notes showing the clauses were never translated, and an internal letter from Cornelius Blackwood ordering Marsh to acquire the Weaver claim by any means necessary. She paused. Heinrich Weaver died 3 weeks after that letter was written. Agatha Poole took the documents with both hands and examined them under the lantern without hurrying. She read each one, completely turning the pages with the careful deliberation of a woman who had learned that evidence must be handled as though it might evaporate. When she looked up, her expression was that of someone seeing a long hypothesis confirmed. Mrs. Colton, she said, this is more than I expected to find. The marshals escorted Marsh and his 3 men out of the cave in handcuffs. Sarah watched Marsh pass through the timber arch into the fading daylight, his shoulders rigid, his jaw locked. He did not look at her as he passed. She had the impression that he had already begun calculating his next move, that in his mind, the arrest was an obstacle to be managed rather than a reckoning to be faced. She had seen that kind of certainty before in men who had spent so long buying their way out of consequences that they could not conceive of a situation where the currency was no longer accepted. That night, after the marshals had taken the prisoners down the slope and the sound of hooves had faded completely, Sarah sat in the main chamber with Agatha Poole. The lamp cast their shadows long against the salt-veined walls. Agatha explained what would come next in spare, precise terms. A federal hearing. charges of contract fraud, evidence tampering, obstruction of federal justice. The evidence from the cave would be central, but it would not be enough on its own. They would need witnesses. They would need corroboration. They would need the kind of case that could not be bought or bullied into silence. "How did you know about the caves?" Sarah asked. Agatha reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded letter. "Clara Penn has been investigating Blackwood and Sons for 2 years. Your husband was her most important source. After the collapse, she had nothing printable, just the spoken word of a man who could no longer speak. It took her 4 months to find the second piece. Your being here in these caves with the Weaver documents. She wrote to me the moment she heard you had left Hardrock Gulch." Sarah was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered. Salt crystals caught the light and released it in small, sharp flashes. "He never told me," she said finally. "He was protecting you," Agatha said. "A man who tells his wife he's building a case against a company that employs him is a man who puts her in danger. James kept you outside the circle because inside the circle is where people get killed." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of James. Full of the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, that laces up its boots and goes to work knowing that the ceiling might come down, that leaves a paper trail in the lining of a boot because a trail is all you can leave when you know they might silence you before you finish speaking. Sarah thought about this for a long time after Agatha retired to her bedroll near the entrance. She lay in the dark with a hand on the diary of Martha Weaver, feeling the cardboard cover through the fabric of her shirt, and she understood something about time that she had not understood before. That the dead do not stop acting. That James, buried under 1,000 tons of rock in the Providence mine, was still pulling threads, still building a case, still reaching forward through Clara Penn and Agatha Poole and the documents in the cave toward a justice he would never see. And Martha Weaver, gone 16 years, vanished into whatever life or death awaited her beyond the borders of this county, was still testifying, still speaking through ink on cardboard, still insisting from across the years that what happened to her and Heinrich mattered and that someone would come who would agree. Sarah pressed her palm flat against the diary through the shirt and felt the cardboard bend slightly under the pressure and thought about what kind of person buries evidence in a cave knowing she will never be the one to use it. The answer, she decided, was the same kind of person who hides a paper in his boot knowing he might not live to see it read. The kind of person who acts not for themselves but for the one who comes after. Before sleep took her, Agatha said one more thing from across the dark chamber. "Mrs. Colton, I should tell you something. This is just the beginning. Marsh has the best lawyer in the territory. He has a judge in his pocket and the money to make witnesses disappear. The cave gave us the evidence, but the courtroom is going to be a different kind of fight." Sarah stared at the ceiling she could not see. "I've been fighting since March," she said. "I know," Agatha said. "That's why I'm here." The lamp had long since gone out. The darkness in the salt cave was total, the kind of dark that presses against the eyes, but Sarah Colton lay in that darkness, with the documents against her skin, and the diary against her heart, and the carbine within reach of her right hand, and she did not feel blind. She felt for the first time in 4 months that she could see the shape of what was coming, and it was not a shape that frightened her. It was the shape of a fight she intended to win. Clara Penn arrived in Hardrock Gulch 3 days after the arrest, riding in the back of a mail wagon because the horse she had rented in Santa Fe had thrown a shoe outside of Cirillo's, and she had continued on foot until the wagon driver found her walking along the road with a notebook so full that the margins were written on diagonally, and the ink on one page had been smeared by a coffee spill that she had blotted without slowing her pen. She was small, wire-rimmed spectacles. The specific energy of a person who does not distinguish between working and breathing. She sat in the tent that Agatha Poole had erected as a base of operations on the outskirts of town and told Sarah what Agatha had not. That James Colton had approached her at the Saturday market in Santa Fe 6 weeks before the collapse, standing beside a barrel of dried beans with his hat pulled low, speaking in short sentences with the economy of a man who knows he is being watched. That he had described in precise detail how the foreman dismantled the shoring on the lowest level one beam at a time, stacking the timbers for transport while the miners worked above. That he had written down the names and hidden the paper where no one would think to look. That they had agreed she would publish when the evidence was strong enough to survive the inevitable denial. The collapse came first, Clara said. After that, I had nothing I could print. Just the word of a dead man. She looked at Sarah across the folding table with its spread of documents and said something that carried no softness and no apology. Your husband knew what could happen to him. That's why he left a trail that someone could follow even if they silenced him. He trusted that the trail would find the right hands. Sarah absorbed this. She thought about James at the Saturday market, a man who had never been to Santa Fe for anything other than supplies, standing beside a barrel of beans and handing the most dangerous information he possessed to a woman he had met once. She thought about the discipline that required, not the courage of a single dramatic act, but the sustained, grinding courage of a man who goes back into the mine every morning, knowing what he knows, who sits across from his wife at supper and does not tell her because telling her would place her inside the circle where people get destroyed. Then Clara moved on to what was new. She had located 2 former Providence miners living in Santa Fe, men who had quit or been fired in the year before the collapse, both willing to testify about safety conditions in the mine. One of them had been present when the foreman began pulling timbers. Their testimony would corroborate what Sutter had told Sarah at the creek bed, but unlike Sutter, these men had no families in Hardrock Gulch and nothing left for Marsh to threaten. Over the following days, the others came. Dolores Crane was the first, a woman of 45 whose husband had died in the Providence mine 3 years before the collapse in another accident that the county coroner had classified as worker negligence. She arrived at Agatha's tent carrying a box of papers she had kept in the bottom of a cedar chest for 3 years, waiting for a moment she had almost stopped believing would come. After Dolores came Philip Hale, 38, whose father had owned a salt concession that Marsh had acquired through coercion in 1879. Philip brought documentation bills of sale with signatures that his father swore to his deathbed had been forged, letters from the county clerk acknowledging receipt of the original deed and then mysteriously losing it from the files. And then Samuel Graywolf arrived. He came on foot from the Mescalero settlement 12 miles to the south, walking the entire distance in a single day, despite being 71 years old and carrying nothing but a canteen and a memory that had not leaked a single detail in 16 years. He sat in Agatha's tent with his hands folded on the table and his eyes fixed on a point beyond the canvas wall, and told them that he had been working as a shoveler in the salt caves in 1873 when Martha Weaver buried the tin box beneath the hearthstones. She had asked him to watch the tunnel entrance while she dug. She had asked him to keep the secret until someone came with a reason to hear it. The white woman with the red hair told me to guard the secret, Samuel said. I've been guarding it since then. I was starting to think nobody would ever come looking. Agatha asked him why he had waited so long, why he had not brought the information forward himself. Samuel looked at her with the patience of a man who has spent 7 decades learning the precise weight of his own voice in a world that was not built to hear it. Mrs. Poole, in 1873, no court in this territory would have taken the word of a mescalero over the word of a white businessman. In 1887, it's not much different. He paused. But if a white woman stands in a federal courtroom holding those papers, and I stand behind her saying I watched them get buried, then they have to listen to both of us. Sarah looked at the old man sitting in the canvas chair with his hands folded and his back straight, and she understood something about strategy that no lawyer had taught her. Samuel had not been passive for 16 years. He had been waiting for the correct configuration of circumstances, the alignment of evidence and witnesses and jurisdiction that would make his testimony matter. He had been playing a game measured not in months but in decades, with the patience of a man who understood that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it is justice deferred to the only moment when it can actually work. The system pushed back the way systems do when threatened, not with a single blow but with a series of calculated pressures designed to make resistance more expensive than surrender. Reverend Whitfield came to Agatha's tent on a Tuesday afternoon. He wore his Sunday coat despite it being midweek, which Sarah interpreted correctly as a signal that he considered this visit official business. He did not sit down. He stood just inside the tent flap with his hat in his hands and addressed Sarah directly, ignoring Agatha, ignoring Clara, ignoring the documents spread across the table. Sarah, I've come to ask you to reconsider. If Marsh goes to prison, the mine closes. 200 families in this town depend on that mine for their livelihood. You have every right to seek justice for James. But do you have the right to destroy the livelihoods of 200 families to get it? The tent was quiet. Clara's pen stopped moving. Dolores Crane, who had been sorting papers in the corner, turned to watch. Sarah looked at Whitfield for a long time. She studied his face the way she had learned to study the rock face of the schist slope, looking for the fracture lines, the places where the surface would give way under pressure. Reverend, she said, when James died, you told me it was God's will. Now you're telling me to sacrifice for 200 families. Every time I'm the one who's supposed to give way. She stood up from her chair. Not this time. Whitfield left without another word. The following Sunday, his sermon contained a passage about women led astray by grief. Half the congregation nodded. Dolores Crane stood up in the middle of it and walked out without a word, and the sound of the church door closing behind her carried more conviction than anything spoken from the pulpit that morning. The attorney Graves representing Marsh attempted bribery first. An emissary appeared at Agatha's tent with an envelope containing $2,000 in cash and a train ticket to California. Sarah returned it without fully opening it. She did not count the money. She did not look at the ticket. She handed the envelope back and said, "Tell Mr. Marsh that if he wanted me gone, he should have given back my house in March." 2 nights later, someone set fire to the tent. The marshals extinguished it before it caused major damage, but the message was delivered. In the darkness afterward, while the smell of scorched canvas still hung in the air, Sarah heard Samuel Graywolf say to Dolores Crane, in a voice that was quiet but carried no trace of fear, "I already waited 16 years. A little more won't stop me." The worst blow came on Thursday, 4 days before the hearing. Clara Penn was intercepted on the road between Santa Fe and Hardrock Gulch by 2 men on horseback who left her with 3 fractured ribs, her notebook stolen, and her spectacles broken in the dirt of the roadside. The marshals found her 2 hours later sitting upright against a fence post, with her arm pressed against her side and her face gray with pain, but her eyes absolutely focused. She arrived at the hearing preparation the next day in a wagon, her arm in a sling, and her spectacles mended with thread. She told Agatha that she had kept copies of all her notes in 3 separate locations because 2 years of investigating Blackwood and Sons had taught her never to trust that the original would survive. The copy of the Santa Fe newspaper carrying her complete article about the operations of Blackwood and Sons headlined, "Decades of Blow Beneath the Salt, How a Mining Company Bought Judges, Killed Workers, and Robbed Widows in Hardrock County," arrived at the courthouse before the lawyers did. There were copies on every bench in the gallery. The night before the hearing, two of Marsh's men found Sarah in the alley behind the boarding house in Santa Fe. They offered her a sum that was not insignificant and a warning that was not subtle. If Marsh went to prison, Sarah would not be safe in any county in the territory where he had associates, and she should calculate whether the outcome was worth the risk. Sarah looked at both men for a moment that extended longer than they expected. They were accustomed to the calculations of fear, to watching people weigh their principles against their safety and arrive at the predictable conclusion. Sarah had made that calculation months ago in a salt cave by lamplight, with a dead woman's diary pressed against her chest, and the answer had not changed. "Tell Marsh," she said, "that if he wanted me gone, he should have returned my house in March." The marshal, who had been following Sarah at 12 paces since she left the boarding house, cocked his revolver with a sound that in the quiet alley was sufficient. The two men left. What Sarah did not learn until the next morning was that Samuel Graywolf, who had also been visited that night, had suffered a fall in his room at the boarding house that fractured his wrist. When Sarah went to see him, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, with his hands splinted and wrapped in cloth, and an expression on his face that she recognized. It was the look of a man who has paid a price and has not regretted paying it. "Martha Weaver buried those papers for someone," Samuel said. "I've been keeping the secret for 16 years. Now that someone is listening, I'm not going to be quiet." Sarah took his hand, the one that was not splinted, and held it. She did not say anything because there was nothing she could say that would not sound insufficient. Samuel squeezed her fingers once briefly and then released them and looked toward the window where the first light of the hearing day was beginning to appear. That night, alone in her room, Sarah took the diary of Martha Weaver from her shirt pocket and opened it to the last page. Below Martha's final entry in the narrow margin at the bottom, she wrote with a pencil stub in careful letters, "Someone read this. Someone used what you left behind. Your name is Martha Weaver, and Hardrock County is going to know who you were." Then she closed the diary and placed it back against her heart and did not sleep for a long time. Not from fear, but from the particular wakefulness that comes before a day that will divide your life into before and after. The morning of the trial dawned clear over Santa Fe with the kind of August blue that in the territory of New Mexico felt almost aggressive in its cleanliness. Sarah Colton entered the federal courthouse carrying the wooden box of documents, her hair pinned back, wearing the most sober dress Agatha Poole had found for her at the second-hand shop on Agua Fria Street, and feeling with each step that she was walking a path James would have wanted her to walk, that Martha Weaver would have recognized, that Dolores Crane and Samuel Graywolf and Clara Penn had waited years to see someone take. The courtroom was full. Federal Judge Herman Baxter was a man from Baltimore who had spent 12 years in the territory of New Mexico and had developed a functional impatience with lawyers who confused rhetoric with argument. He called the room to order with a single strike of his gavel and surveyed the gallery. Miners, widows of miners, representatives from 2 newspapers. The mayor of Hardrock Gulch seated in the last row, with the expression of a man attending a proceeding he suspects will end his career. Baxter wasted no words. "This court is hearing charges against Randall Marsh for contract fraud evidence, manipulation, obstruction of federal justice, and accessory charges of incitement to bodily harm. Proceedings will follow federal law. Anyone who interrupts will be removed." Marsh sat beside his attorney Lucius Graves with the composure of a man who has purchased his exit from worse situations and believes this one will be no different. He wore a dark suit, freshly pressed, and his hands rested on the defense table, with the stillness of someone who has rehearsed calm until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. The morning testimony laid the foundation. Dolores Crane spoke about her husband's death in 1882 and the irregularities that no one had investigated because the county coroner answered to the same men who owned the mine. Philip Hale presented the documentation of the coerced sale of his father's salt concession, walking the jury through forged signatures and missing deeds with the methodical anger of a man who has spent nearly a decade assembling a case in a drawer because no one would open a courtroom. The document experts sent by the Department of Justice from Denver testified that the 4 documents found in the salt cave were authentic with dating consistent with the years indicated and no subsequent alterations. The wax seals were original and unbroken. Graves cross-examined the expert for 40 minutes, attempting to undermine the authenticity of the Blackwood internal letter. He did not succeed. Then Graves played his card. He called a witness the prosecution had not anticipated, the foreman of the Providence mine, a man named Drucker, who had been in Marsh's employ for 9 years and who had been located and coached during the weeks between the arrest and the hearing. Drucker took the stand and testified in a flat, rehearsed voice that James Colton had been a careless worker who routinely violated safety protocols, that the collapse was caused by natural geological fracture, and that the allegations of timber removal were fabricated by a grieving widow seeking someone to blame. Sarah sat in the gallery and listened to her dead husband being called careless. James Colton, who checked his safety line twice before every descent, who taught new miners how to read stress fractures in ceiling rock, who came home every evening and washed his hands 3 times because he respected the mine enough to take its residue seriously. She gripped the edge of the bench. Her face did not change, but inside something was burning at a temperature she had not felt before, hotter than grief, hotter than anger, closer to the white center of a flame where heat becomes light. The jury murmured. Isaac Grant, the young federal prosecutor, glanced at Agatha with concern that he tried and failed to conceal. Drucker's testimony had introduced reasonable doubt. If it stood unchallenged, it could undermine everything. Agatha leaned towards Sarah. Your testimony needs to undo this, she said quietly, not with emotion, with precision. Grant called Sarah to the stand. He gave her room to narrate the facts in order from the eviction to the cave to the discovery of the documents, with short questions that allowed her to develop the story without feeling guided. Sarah spoke in an even voice, looking at Judge Baxter more than at the jury, because Agatha had told her that juries follow the witness's gaze, but judges follow logic, and she needed both to follow her. When the direct examination ended, Graves rose. He was a man of resource, and his resources were precisely what Sarah had anticipated. He asked if she had completed formal schooling. She told him she had reached the 4th grade. He asked if she could read legal documents in English. She told him she had learned enough. He asked how she could be certain the documents she claimed to have found had not been planted by someone with a vested interest in the case. Because they were sealed with wax since 1873, she answered, and the expert who just testified confirmed the wax was undisturbed. Graves shifted angles. He asked how long she had lived alone in the caves. 4 days, she answered. He asked whether there had been other occupants during that time. No, she answered. He asked with the particular inflection of a man planting an insinuation, without articulating it, whether she could be sure of that. I can be sure, Sarah said, and she added nothing more because silence after a firm answer occupies more space than explanation. Graves attempted one final line. He argued that a widow without formal education could not possibly interpret legal documents, and that her conclusions about the contents of the Blackwood letter were speculation without technical foundation. Sarah looked at Judge Baxter. She recited from memory because she had spent 4 days reading it until every word was engraved in her mind, the final paragraph of the Blackwood letter. The letter states that if the Weaver problem is not resolved voluntarily, Marsh must use the methods that have proven effective before. She paused. Heinrich Weaver died 3 weeks after that letter was written. I don't need a formal education to know what those words mean. The courtroom reacted, not with noise, but with its opposite, a collective intake of breath that compressed the air in the room. Judge Baxter did not need to use his gavel because the silence returned on its own, carrying the weight of something that had been said and could not be unsaid. Graves stood for a moment with his papers in his hand, recalculating, then sat down. Grant moved immediately. He called one of the former Providence miners Clara had located in Santa Fe, a man named Harker, who had worked the night shift until he was fired 6 months before the collapse. Harker testified in plain language that he had personally witnessed the foreman Drucker removing support timbers from the lowest level on 3 separate occasions, that James Colton had confronted Drucker about it in the presence of 4 other miners, and that Drucker had told Colton to mind his business or find another mine. The testimony landed on top of Drucker's earlier statement and flattened it. The jury did not murmur this time. They were silent in the way people are silent when they are no longer uncertain. Grant called his final witness, a man of middle age in a dusty traveling suit who identified himself as Edward Fenn, son of the mining engineer Aldous Fenn, whose report on the silver vein of level 3 was one of the 4 documents from the cave. My father kept a copy of that report, Fenn said. He gave it to me the year he died in 1901 with instructions to present it to the authorities if the Weaver case ever reached a courtroom. He paused and something moved behind his eyes that was not rehearsed. He said he had been threatened into silence. He said he never forgave himself. Graves rose to object to the admission of the document. Judge Baxter looked at him for 3 seconds with the specific expression of a man who has heard enough objections for one lifetime. He denied the motion. The copy of the Fenn report was identical to the original found in the cave. 2 versions of the same document, one kept for decades by the son of the man who wrote it, the other buried beneath the stones of a cold hearth in a salt cave by the wife of the man who was murdered because of what it described. They matched in every number, every seal, every line. 2 separate paths through time converging in the same courtroom on the same afternoon, each one confirming the other with the precision of 2 witnesses who have never met telling the same story. The jury retired at 3 in the afternoon. They returned at 5:40. The jury foreman was a rancher from Taos with large hands and a direct voice and no inclination to cultivate unnecessary suspense. He read the verdict in 14 seconds. Guilty on all principal charges. Guilty on 3 of the 4 accessory charges. Marsh did not collapse dramatically. He sat motionless, staring forward with the expression of a man recalibrating his options and finding none remaining. It was, Sarah thought, the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. Judge Baxter passed sentence in the same session, 25 years imprisonment without possibility of early reduction. Total confiscation of Blackwood and Sons' assets for reparation to documented victims. Opening a formal investigation into Sheriff Graydon and Judge Fitch of the county. Then Baxter did something Sarah did not expect. He removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly, and looked toward the witness bench. Mrs. Colton, this court formally recognizes the validity of the mining concession title in the name of Martha and Heinrich Weaver, which under federal law passes to the person in legitimate documented possession. A pause. The court also finds, in light of testimony presented, that the debt contract signed by James Colton was obtained through deception and declares null its effect on the conjugal property. The disputed property will be restored to you, Mrs. Colton. Sarah walked out of the federal courthouse of Santa Fe into the late afternoon of a Tuesday in August of 1887 with the document box under her arm and tears running down her face without her doing anything to stop them. She had not cried since the day the mule died on the red dirt road outside Hardrock Gulch. These were different. These did not come from the place where grief lives. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, from the same place where Martha Weaver had found the strength to bury a tin box under hearthstones in the dark, from the same place where James had found the resolve to fold a piece of paper and slided it into his boot on a morning when he knew the ceiling might come down before the day was done. The spring that followed transformed the excavated hills of Hardrock Gulch in ways Sarah had not anticipated. Without the constant activity of Blackwood and Sons, without the dust of the ore wagons, without the wooden scaffolding multiplying each month, the earth began to reclaim the edges of its wounds with the patient insistence of something that has time. Sagebrush first, then along the channels where snowmelt ran in March yellow flowers that had no name. Sarah knew, so she called them simply the slope flowers because they were hers, in the same way that everything on that slope was now hers. The Weaver mining concession transferred legally to her name in November of 1887 proved to be exactly what the engineer Aldous Fenn had described in 1873. Sarah contracted its operation to a mining company from Denver with a single condition written into the agreement in language that Isaac Grant helped her draft with the same care he had applied to the prosecution. No worker would sign any document without an interpreter in his own language explaining every clause first. The first royalty payment arrived in February of 1888. Sarah used half of it to buy back the Adobe house with the corral on the outskirts of Hardrock Gulch. She restored it without haste with her own hands, and with workers she paid in cash and on time because she had learned that dignity cannot be negotiated from need but can be offered from sufficiency. She built a new porch. She planted a garden in the corral. She hung on the parlor wall, framed in simple wood, the original mining concession title of Heinrich Weaver. Not as a trophy, as a reminder that the stories of those who fight are often buried deeper than the minerals they fought over, but they do not disappear. Dolores Crane was the first to move onto the adjacent property that Sarah purchased with the second royalty payment and divided into parcels. Then Philip Hale's sister with her 3 children. Then a woman named Margaret, whom Sarah had never met, who arrived from the neighboring county because she had heard that in Hardrock Gulch there was a widow who had land and helped people. They established a formal cooperative in the autumn of 1888. Isaac Grant helped draft the bylaws with the practical loyalty of a man who understood that justice does not end with the verdict. The cooperative managed the gardens, purchased seeds collectively, and included an emergency clause that allowed any member to receive advances without interest in cases of documented crisis. Clara Penn published 3 more articles on the consequences of the case. The second about reforms to the labor contracts in the mines of the territory of New Mexico was cited in the legislative discussion that culminated in 1889 with an ordinance requiring certified interpreters at the signing of any labor contract with workers who did not speak English. Agatha Poole sent Sarah the newspaper clipping with the note that read simply, "James would have known what the thing he signed was for." One afternoon, sorting through the mail that now arrived regularly at the Adobe house, Sarah found a letter with no return address. The postmark was Denver. Inside a single sheet of paper with a single line written in a hand she did not immediately recognize and then did. "I can sleep now. Wade Sutter." She never heard from him again. She folded the letter and placed it in the cedar chest beside Dolores Crane's box of papers and Martha Weaver's diary in the archive of small acts of conscience that together weighed more than any single act of power. The school came in 1890, when the teacher Hardrock Gulch had employed for years retired and no one took her place. Sarah offered the porch of the Adobe house while they raised funds for a building. The Tuesday and Thursday class with 8 children from the cooperative families became 12, then 20, and the building was completed before the year was out. Samuel Graywolf attended the Friday classes. Not as a student, he sat in the back and listened. Sarah had asked him once whether he wanted to teach something, knowing that his memory held decades of history that no book contained. He had said he was thinking about it. A year later, he began to speak on Fridays for 15 minutes about the salt caves, about who had worked in them and under what conditions, about the names that appeared in no official record but existed nonetheless because someone remembered them. The children listened in silence, the way children listen when they sense that what they are hearing is not a lesson but a transmission. Something passed from one generation to the next, not through books, but through the voice of a man who was there. On the afternoon when Hardrock Gulch celebrated the official opening of the school building, a structure of adobe with 2 large windows and a name carved above the door, the Martha and Heinrich Weaver School, Sarah Colton stayed behind after the children and the teachers and the neighbors, and Dolores Crane with her young son had all gone home. She closed the door carefully. She ran her fingers across the carved letters of the name. Then she walked to the porch of the adobe house and sat down. The hills to the northeast were gray in that evening's light, shifting toward the deeper gray that preceded full dark. The entrance to the salt cave was invisible from this distance, but it was there. The way things you know exist remain present even when you cannot see them. The wind carried the scent of sage and the damp earth from the irrigated garden. Sarah sat and breathed and did not think about anything in particular. She had lost everything. Husband, house, security, the life she had believed she would have. But in rebuilding from what remained, she had found something that no contract could take from her and no judge could grant. The solid certainty that she was capable of surviving any storm and that this capacity was not hers alone. It belonged to everyone who came before and everyone who would come after as long as someone took the trouble to remember them. The sun finished its descent. The first stars appeared over the excavated hills of Hardrock Gulch, faint at first, then steady the way all things that endure begin. Sarah Colton stood up from the porch, looked once more at the hills where the salt cave held its silence, and went inside her house.